this will be recorded. I'm recording it for FEA, but it will be available for any of you guys as well if you want to go back and review. So we're talking about, we're moving away from the maritime empires, as you know, to the land-based empires, and we're talking about what are known as gunpowder empires. And they're called gunpowder empires for a very important reason. These land-based empires expanded because they learned how to marshal the weapons, the new weapons of gunpowder. And really, this is something new in the time period of between 1400 and 1450 and 1750. You might say that the beginning of this time period, the kickoff, so to speak, was in 1453. So you should know that in 1453, the city of Constantinople fell to the Ottomans. Constantinople was the capital city of the Byzantine Empire that was the continuation of Roman civilization for 1,000 years after the western half of Roman Empire fell. And this was a really big deal when Constantinople fell. This was a city that was protected by concentric walls. It had pasture and agricultural land within those walls, and it had underwater cisterns. So it was siege-proof. You couldn't surround the city and starve them out. But what they did not count on was the rise of firearms and gunpowder weapons. And the Sultan Mehmed II, whose name is over there, M-E-H-M-E-D, Mehmed II, had as his lifetime passion the task of taking the city of Constantinople. And when he did, you know about this in other contexts in this class. 1453, the city fell, and you know that Europeans decided to reroute their trade. And that's why Vasco da Gama was sailing around Africa, trying to get around what was now a trade network completely dominated by Muslims. And that really leads to the age of exploration on the part of Iberians or Western Europeans. So the fall of Constantinople, in a sense, is really a major turning point in history. And so that's why 1450, kind of averaging off 3 years here, is kind of the beginning of a new era in history. So this whole time period kind of awakens because of the power that we see in gunpowder. So when Constantinople fell, the Ottoman Empire moved from this area of Anatolia all the way into Eastern Europe, and their expansion would go all the way to Vienna. There'll be a very famous failed siege of Vienna that would stop the Ottoman advance. So let's stop for a second and talk about the Ottomans. The Ottomans emerged from what you know about in the previous time period, and that is unified Islam, ruled by Arabs, gets shattered, right? Baghdad falls, the Abbasid Caliphate crumbles, that was in topic 1.2, and a unified Arab-based Islamic culture is replaced by smaller Turkish-based cultures, and this is one of them. It's Osman the Great, who forms, whose tribe they convert to Islam, and they begin to take over other areas around them, and they amalgamate this empire called the Ottomans. We saw this as well with the Seljuks, and the Seljuks in the last period, if you remember, took Jerusalem, and that would provoke the Crusades. So you have multiple vectors of power across Islam. So Osman forms his empire. It's known as the Ottoman Empire. They become the arch rivals of the Christian Byzantine Empire, whose capital is Constantinople, and when it falls, they move over into here. All three of these empires that you see here, the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals, are all Muslim empires. They're all based in part on the power of gunpowder. So we've already seen that gunpowder gave the Spanish an edge in the New World. It's having the same type of thing over here. Now, an important thing about gunpowder is it favors large, wealthy states because smaller kingdoms can't afford to equip their armies with gunpowder. It's that expensive. Rifles, which are nothing like rifles we have today, and cannon, which are nothing like the cannon that you imagine when I say that word, were bulkier, they were less accurate, they were slower to load and fire, but still they were a huge advantage in battle, but they were enormously expensive. So you had to have states that were very, very well funded in order to do this, and that meant that large empires or large states had an added benefit over the smaller ones, and that's why you have the rise of these three gunpowder empires. The Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals. We're going to deal with all of these. We will talk about the Safavids a little bit. The noted distinction here is that this one is a Shia state. You have Sunni over here, Sunni over there, but the Safavids are a Shia state. And one thing, if you look at the topics that we're dealing with here, topic 3.1, 3.2, and 3.3, one of them is how they used religion. I think that's 3.3. The Ottomans would take their belief that they were the defenders of the true form of Islam. And that would be a powerful ideological basis for their expansion. They were defenders of the real Islam, which meant that their enemies weren't so much Christians and Jews and other monotheists. Their enemies were those who thought that they were Muslims, but they thought really weren't. That's what's most dangerous when you have that type of belief dynamic. So they thought the most dangerous thing were the Shia, because the Shia are convinced that they are Muslim, but the Sunni thought that they were not. So this is the dynamic that you have here. So the Ottoman Empire, after the fall of Constantinople, what's important here is they take over what was largely a Christian empire. So the former Byzantine falls under their lands, and you have a characteristic of land-based empires that we're going to deal with in all of the models that we're going to look at. And that characteristic is this: expansion brings cultural and ethnic diversity, and all of these empires have to find some way how to deal with that diversity. You're using a religious ideology to rule, but there are people in your empire who don't hold to that religious ideology. You either incorporate them or alienate them. You have to deal with them in some way. And this is a good comparison to do as you're studying these empires, to look at the different ways they handle minority groups as they grow and become more and more diverse. So we're going to look at two things that develop from this rapid expansion when, after the fall of the city, instantly there's this incredible amount of land that falls into Ottoman hands, occupied mainly by Christians and some Jews. So two things come out of this. First of all, the Ottomans develop a system called DEVSHIRME, and that you should have seen that in your reading. DEVSHIRME, it's a Turkish word that means the gathering. And what they would do is, when they marched into areas, they would conscript young boys from the captured Christian homes. And these young boys, sometimes toddlers, they were taken by the Ottomans. They were raised in Muslim schools, sometimes back in the capital. They were converted to Islam, and they were brought up as men who had no connection to their families whatsoever. And that was an important thing. It sounds kind of cruel, but what it did, it meant that they had no base of power except for their allegiance to the state. All right? A problem with empires is that wealthy families can pool their resources together and ally with other powerful bases and challenge your authority. If you're cut off from that type of family network, which all of these boys were, you alleviated that threat, and you were raising a group of state servers of the state whose only allegiance was directly to the state itself. So these Christian boys were brought in, they were converted, they were trained, and many of them entered the elite fighting force of the Ottoman Empire, which is known as the Janissaries. The Janissaries was also in your reading. So what's the big deal about the Janissaries? A lot of these empires use cavalry, but cavalry was not the same thing as gunpowder forces. They simply could not use firearms from mounted horses. So the Janissaries were the infantry, and they were brought up completely with military training. That's all they had. And the Ottoman state could trust them because they did not have these family bases to fall back on. And because of that, they were the group that was trusted with the new weapons of gunpowder. Look, you're not going to come up with this weapon that's very powerful and trust it to anyone, because it could easily be turned against you. You don't want them to become involved in a civil war against you from someone in your own ranks. The Janissaries, since they have no backing from family, They don't even know their families, for the most part. They're the ones trusted with gunpowder, and they have nothing but elite military training. So they're like in the Marines, you might say, the Green Beret, the Rangers in the Army, the SEALs in the Navy. They're those who are all about combat, and that's all they know. All right? And they're not really so much involved into, at the beginning, they're not really involved into promotion and getting a new badge. They're the elite fighting forces. If a battle's going wrong, the Ottomans will call in the Janissaries. So, Janissaries advanced. They had a lot to do with why they spread so rapidly across this area. And Janissaries and military elites were awarded with land grants from captured land. And the resources would be the payment to the military elites. All right? Now, what dynamic was set in place by this is very important. It meant that if the Ottoman Empire was not in the continual state of expanding, that it was going to weaken itself. All right? There's no more availability of resources and land grants that really become the salary for the military elites, the military aristocracy, and you're not gathering the DEVSHIRME, the gathering. You're no longer gathering these fresh recruits. And what's going to happen if the Ottomans stop expanding? The Janissaries, instead of being taken from families and raised, will turn into a hereditary class because there are no more being gathered. And once they become a hereditary class, their status is inherited from their parents, and then they marry into powerful merchant or political families, and the whole benefit of Janissaries gets defeated because now they do have power bases. And this is what's going to happen. Janissaries are going to be involved in all kinds of political disputes, and it's worth mentioning that a major weakness throughout the entire history of the Ottoman Empire is this. There are no clear-cut rules of succession whatsoever. That means when a sultan dies, there's no set pattern in Ottoman civilization on who the next one's going to be. So there's potential for civil war every time there's a change in power from one sultan to another. And this is a perpetual weakness. And Janissaries start to get involved in that, to get people in there who, of course, are going to confer favor back on them. And this becomes a weakening of the Ottoman Empire in the long run. So you have that weakens the Ottoman Empire. But that's one implication. That's one way they dealt with the expansion. They integrated Christians as Janissaries. How would this look on the AP test? You may have a question or an essay about how empire expansion changed social structures. All right? How did the expansion of empires transform social structures? Here you talk about the Janissaries. Just like if you're dealing with the Spanish empires in the New World, you would talk about a race-based class system with peninsulares, remember, and Creoles. That's the class system. And we'll see the same thing with the Chinese. We'll see the same thing with the Russians when they expand. So that is a really ripe essay topic. It's so clear in the topic pages, but that essay has never happened on an AP test before, so I'm kind of looking for something along those lines. How did the expansion of empires transform social structures? Here's an example of the rise of a new powerful elite called the Janissaries. Now, I told you there were two implications of this incredible sweep of previous Christian territory. The other one is this. They had to deal with people of a different culture already living there. And there were mostly Orthodox Christians, but there were also some pockets of Jews living there in the former Byzantine Empire. Now, in Islam, in the Quran, you have this idea called the people of the book. And what that means is Muslims believe that that Jewish people with their patriarch Abraham, and then Christians with Jesus, all received revelation from the same God that they worship. All right? Allah, the God. That's Allah is God. It's simply the Arabic word for God. And they would hold that the revelations to Abraham, who they consider a very important person as well, were given and then maybe lost somewhere along the way or corrupted, and then the same thing happened with Jesus. And by the way, Jesus is an extremely important person in Islam. If you look in the Quran, he's mentioned several times there. But it's very clear to say that Jesus was not any type of God. And this is where Christianity and Islam separate. Okay? They have that reverence for Jesus. But he's a prophet. And the followers and the generations after Jesus' death corrupted some of his teachings and made him into be something that he wasn't from their point of view. And then with Muhammad comes the seal of the prophet, they call it. It's been done, it's sealed. Gabriel spoke directly and dictated the Quran to Muhammad, and that's, in its original Arabic, that's the final revelation. So there is this affinity with Jews and Christians in Islam. For that reason, they were tolerated in the Ottoman Empire. Okay? So what did that toleration look like? You need to know something called the millet system. M-I-L-L-E-T. The millet system. What is a millet? And it's not a type of grain like you might think. But millet is basically a region. Think of a county or a little pocket of the population that has a majority number of Christians in it. And as they took over this new land, of course, there were many millets within the Ottoman Empire. So let's say right over here you have a pocket of Christians, and over here there's a concentration of Jews. They became millets. So regions or districts. And Ottoman law allowed each millet to operate according to that culture. In other words, even though you're in the Muslim Ottoman Empire, if you live within a Christian millet, you still have your religious holidays, your religious laws. You didn't practice Ramadan, you had Christmas and Easter. And religious Christian laws could be used to rule the community. If you were in a Jewish millet, you had synagogues, okay? And you did bar mitzvahs. And you basically preserved the culture of the millet. And so there was this tolerance for, this is important, tolerance for the other Abrahamic monotheistic faiths. There were no millets for polytheists, by the way. They were not welcome. There were no Buddhist or Hindu millets, because polytheism is not acceptable in Islam. But Christians and Jews were allowed, and they could preserve their own culture. All right? Matter of fact, the reputation for Islam's tolerance of other monotheists was so great that, remember the unification of Iberia? Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492 finally finished the reconquest. They defeated Granada, the last Muslim stronghold, and they banned all Muslims and Jews in 1492. Kicked them all out. Tons of Jews, thousands of Jews, fleeing Catholic Spain, went to the Ottoman Empire, where they were treated much better than they would have, especially with the rise of the Inquisition that you had in Spain. So they were, and by the way, this actually hurt Spain because they were kicking out people who were merchants and craftsmen and had made a lot from themselves. Not that Catholics weren't as well, but there were Muslims and Jews who were very much involved in trade, and they actually went to the Ottoman Empire and strengthened the Ottoman Empire. Look, this has never helped a civilization in history. All right, jettisoning people because of some type of belief. Think about Nazi Germany. All right, U.S. got Albert Einstein. All right, Oppenheimer, other very important scientists who ironically made the atom bombs that would bring World War II to a swifter conclusion, you might argue. So this is what Spain is going to do. But the millet system is very, it shows the tolerance of the Ottoman state. Now, one more thing to know about this. Christians and Jews could have the freedom of their religion in the Ottoman Empire within the millet. Now, there's no getting around the truth that they were considered, you might say, second-rate citizens. Living in millets prevented you from being able to rise up in the ranks. Okay, you could not move up the bureaucracy of the Ottoman state. And there was one other thing that you had to do. You had to pay a special religious tax called the jizya. All right? That's J-I-Z-Y-A. You might want to know that. J-I-Z-Y-A. This is the religious tax that Christians and Jews, so people living in millets, paid to the Ottoman state. Everybody in the empire paid taxes. This is just one additional one. Okay? And by the way, it's worth mentioning that the jizya tax was almost nothing. It was extremely, extremely low. It was more of a token thing that the Ottoman Empire did, like tribute. Like China would make people pay tribute, and then once they got it, they'd give even bigger gifts back. This wasn't about we need to get money from these people. It was to show, it was a reminder of who was boss. So you might almost say that Christians and Jews with this small tax were purchasing the ability to practice their religion in their own millet. So you did have that. But as you know, that did increase taxes for trade coming through the Ottoman Empire, and this has a lot to do with why Europeans, especially Iberians at first, would look for different trade routes. Because not only did you have the typical taxes that Muslims would charge, and you're also enriching Muslims, but if it came through any Christian hands, you had the jizya tax as well. And so, hence Vasco da Gama and Columbus, all trying to get around that. So that all ties together here. So these are fundamentals of Ottoman expansion, the Ottoman state, and the way it dealt with diversity. All right. I do want to mention one other thing about the Ottomans. All of these empires are going to use art or architecture to legitimize their rule. In other words, to make their rule acceptable to people, they're going to use art. And I know you, from the AP Wordopedia, you may know this. The form of art that became popular in the Ottoman Empire, is called miniatures. All right, miniatures. And a lot of art back then was a whole fresco, a whole wall, or the whole ceiling of a church. A miniature is probably like a painting, like you would think of it. And these were perfected during the Ottoman times. The government sponsored these. So these were pictures. And the pictures were important. This is a form of media. The pictures were important for reminding people of some of the great things that the Ottoman state had done. For example, there is a very famous one that was circulated, and it is a picture of Mehmed II laying siege to and defeating Constantinople. Look, it's hard to exaggerate how big a deal that was. The Ottomans seemed unstoppable after 1453. And by the way, in less than a century after that, Christian knights were wreaking havoc all over the Mediterranean on Ottoman merchant trade, and they were fighting from a stronghold, which is the island of Rhodes, which is a Greek island today. They're called the Knights of Knights of St. John of the Cross was the name of this order of knights. And they had a fortress on the island of Rhodes. And the Ottomans sieged that fortress and drove the knights away. And that was that freed up the eastern part of the Mediterranean. By the way, the knights went to Malta, and a couple decades later, they sieged Malta as well, and it did not work. That would have meant that the Ottomans could have worked their way up Sicily and then up the boot of Italy, and history probably would have been a lot different. But anyway, these famous battles show up in these pieces of art from the Ottoman Empire, for example. Oh, by the way, this is just an image of Janissaries on the battlefield. They didn't dress like we would think soldiers dress today. They were very distinguished in the way they looked. You could tell who the Janissaries were. Their clothing indicated rank, but you see the firearms given to them in battle. Here is a miniature, and this is, by the way, the Siege of Rhodes. These are the knights, the Christian knights, who will be ejected, and the soldiers who took over and defeated that. So that's some nuts and bolts about the Ottoman Empire. Now I want to jump over, since we're talking about art, and I want to talk about the Chinese use of art too. All right? And then later we'll look at the Russians, how they use art and architecture as well. But the Chinese use of art is extremely interesting. So I need to give you a little bit of heads up about China in this time period. The good news is this is the last Chinese dynasty you'll ever have to learn, because it's the last Chinese dynasty. And it goes all the way to World War I, and then there's some attempts at other things, and there's a civil war, and the communists take over, and that's where we are today. But this last dynasty is called the Qing, not to be confused with the Chen, the Q-I-N-G. So just a little bit of things to help you here. Qing is the name of the dynasty. What's unique about them is that they are not Chinese. This is the second time in China's history when they were conquered and ruled by foreign invaders. You should know the first time were the Mongols. The Mongols conquered China and they ruled it for a century, and then a peasant revolt using gunpowder drove them off, and that established the Ming Dynasty. The Chinese were back. The Ming wanted to flush themselves of all these horrible Mongol influences as they thought of them. They built the Great Wall that you see today. They started trade again. They kind of isolated themselves from foreign culture, and then they became enormously corrupt. The Ming is ruling China when the potatoes and the peanuts are coming in from the Columbian Exchange and increasing their population. When silver from the New World is making its way over to purchase things like silk and porcelain, and the Chinese are becoming enormously wealthy. The emperor is living in the center of Beijing in a place called the Forbidden City, isolated from the rest of China, where they just live in this lap of luxury and decadence, while China starts to go downhill, and they're completely ignorant of the state of China in this time period, during the Ming. Japanese piracy is wreaking havoc on their economy, capturing silver from ships, just like the English are doing in the Caribbean with Spanish silver. So China's having its share of problems during the Ming. A group of nomads, the Chinese would call them barbarians, a group of nomads above the border called the Manchus, all right, are growing into a powerful confederation. The Manchus are these are the type of people that the Great Wall was meant to keep out. But a border dispute between two Chinese aristocrats led one of them to invite the Manchu to come over and help them defeat another Chinese warlord. Of course, the Manchu gleefully accepted that. They're welcomed across the wall. The Manchus came in and not only helped that Chinese group defeat another Chinese group, they defeated everybody and they went straight to Beijing. The Ming was so corrupt, they didn't even know there was a problem in China until these foreign invaders were outside the Forbidden City. The Manchus took over and named themselves the Qing Dynasty, and they will rule China for several hundred years. This is the last dynasty in Chinese history. But it's important to remember two things about the Qing. They're foreigners. They're not ethnic Han Chinese. And secondly, they will expand China larger than it has ever been in history before, really to the borders of present-day China today. So the Han, the Song, the Ming never had the territorial size that the Qing had, which means diversity is going to increase, and they need to find a new apparatus of the state to control such a vast empire. And that brings us to the content about the Qing. All right, the Qing are Manchu. There's no ethnic group called Chinese. They're called the Han people. That's what, there are many, many different ethnicities. I think over 80 ethnicities in China. But the Han are what we would typically call Chinese. So the Manchu come in, they set up rule, and foreigners are now ruling China. What's going on in Europe? The Renaissance. And a very famous Italian painter travels over here and lives in Beijing, and the Manchu emperor, Emperor Kanji, becomes his patron and commissions this painter to paint several imperial portraits of the emperor. And we're going to look at a few of them right now, okay? I want you to look at these carefully as we analyze these portraits. So with the Ottomans, you had paintings called miniatures. With Qing China, we have a work of art, or a genre of art, called imperial portraiture. Okay? Imperial portraiture, portraits of the emperor. Now, in the age of Snapchat and Instagram and everything else, we've lost the importance of images because they're so cheap, they're so easy to take and so easy to delete. But there was a time when these were extremely expensive endeavors. You're an artist, you're going to make a lot of money painting a portrait for an emperor, and you want to do exactly what the emperor wants. You want to represent the emperor the way he wants to be seen. Because today, anyone here could recognize the President of the United States if you saw a picture of him. Matter of fact, a lot of people around the world could, even though they've never seen the President. Works of art was about the only way anyone would have a glimpse of what the emperor looked like. Okay? So, here's the first painting that we're going to look at right here. So here is Emperor Kanji. think about this. He's what the Chinese would call a barbarian. He's ruling. This picture depicts him in the city of Beijing, which is the capital, and it was meant for an audience in Beijing. In other words, Han Chinese people. And you look at this, usually students pull out a couple things right away. Like, for example, his fingernails are kind of long. I don't know if you can see that. Long fingernails. And the context of where he is. He's not on his throne. He's not holding a sword. He's reading a book, and he's in a library. Now, your mind should be turning now. How am I going to contextualize this? What do I know about Chinese history that would lead the emperor to want to be portrayed the way he is in this painting? All right. I would normally ask you for questions and everything, but since this is a recording, I'll just move forward with this. The way to get political legitimacy in China ever since Han Wudi, way back 2000 or 200 BC, was scholarship. Scholarship in Confucian classics, and you proved that by taking the civil service test, right? You took this test, you showed that you're a consummate scholar, and that gave you legitimacy in the ranks of the bureaucracy. He is trying to assuage the fears of Chinese that they got themselves a barbarian. First of all, he does not do manual labor. These are not the hands of a warrior or someone who does any type of labor whatsoever. He's dressed in a garment worn by elites. I don't really know much about the hat, but he put himself in the library. He's like, listen, folks, I'm one of you. I'm a scholar, just like your leaders. So he's appealing. He's making his foreignness feel more familiar, and he's trying to downplay it in this carefully crafted image. So what legitimizes rule in the eyes of the Chinese? It is scholarship. And so hence he has himself portrayed as a Confucian scholar. All right, very well done. Now, same emperor, same artist. Look at this one. And I put two pictures up. One is just a reference so you can kind of see what the style is supposed to look like. On the left, this is a Mongol noble. Notice the shape of the outer garment going across the head here and the fur cap. What you see over here is the exact same thing. All right? There's a rabbit down there, so I'm feeling a little Taoism splash here too. But it's very clear that now he's being represented as a Mongol noble, a leader of Mongols. Chinese don't like Mongols, okay? And I'll tell you, this painting was not meant to be shown in Beijing, or it was not meant to be shown among the Han people. All right? You could probably think ahead and think, I wonder what area was conquered during the reign of Kangxi. All right? Who's he trying to placate here? So the date here, 1730. I want you to keep that in your head for a second. The date is 1730. He's no longer in the library. Okay? Here's the next one. And this is painted for the same audience. All right, this guy's a warrior now. He's a mounted warrior. And this would have much more resonance among Mongolian people than it would the Han Chinese, who would be fearful of him representing himself like that. Okay? So again, this would probably have the same intended audience. So I told you the date of these paintings. We're talking about 1730. So let's look at the history of the expansion of the Qing to try to piece some of this stuff together. All right, so here we have the Qing or Manchu homeland. Their first wave of expansion into this dark maroon area. You see they crossed the Great Wall, then down here. Now, 1730 was when those paintings were made. So find in the expansion here what was being conquered in 1730, and you see it. All right, it's this color. This is the conquest that was going on when those paintings were made. Mongolia, okay? This guy is working his social media, okay? Those paintings were not for Beijing. That would have caused the opposite effect. These paintings were meant in the same way as the scholar painting to assuage the fear of Mongols, like, I'm the type of leader that you're used to, all right? So you don't have anything to worry about. Look, Mongols, if they saw their leader as a Confucian scholar with long fingernails sitting in a library, no, that would not work with them. Okay? Like, no, it wouldn't work. So let's look at one more here. As a matter of fact, if you look at this map and you look at this color right here, Mongolia and Tibet were both conquered. Tibet's a whole other story. But Tibet has they're fiercely independent. They have a distinctive type of Buddhism. And in the earlier Mongol conquests, the Mongols kind of went around Tibet and allowed them to govern themselves and gave the mandate to rule to someone who got the title Dalai Lama. Okay, there is a Dalai Lama today, but he's not living in China. The Chinese today fear the independent spirit of Tibet. So Tibet is Buddhist, has its own distinctive type of Buddhism with their own, you might call them Buddhist saints, that are called bodhisattvas. Important men in Buddhism who gained such holiness or such dharma that instead of reincarnating, they decided to stay here and give their surplus karma to others. Exactly the same function that saints with their surplus grace have in Roman Catholicism. That grace is dispensed when you pray to other saints. So you have these bodhisattvas in Tibetan Buddhism. Now, this area was conquered. Let's look at a painting. Last painting we're going to look at of Emperor Kanji. And here he is. Now, I'll give you a close-up in a second. But I want to point out all these famous people in Tibetan history that are embedded around this. And if we focus in just a second, this is the emperor. He's making the Buddhist sign, and he's surrounded by lotus flowers. This is not a warrior on a horse with arrows. It's not a Confucian scholar. Those would not make sense here. Matter of fact, this whole genre of art, this is a well-recognized form of painting in Tibet that was already made to illustrate a famous bodhisattva, a hero of Tibetan Buddhism. And Kanji had the Italian artist simply repaint it and put his face on top of the bodhisattva. All right? And we know the destiny of this painting. This painting was a personal gift from the emperor to the Dalai Lama in Tibet. Look at me. Now, in all fairness, Kanji did convert to Buddhism. So he's not being completely hypocritical about the symbolism of Buddhism here. But he's doing the same thing that he did for the Han back in Beijing, for the Mongols, and for the Tibetan Buddhists. He's trying to become all things to all people. All right, so let's back up for a second. This type of work, this type of art is called imperial portraiture. How was imperial portraiture used to legitimize the power of the state? It's an interesting question. If you have ever had to write about how states legitimize the rule during this incredible time of expansion and ethnic and cultural diversity, the emperor crafted works of art or commissioned works of art that would reach out to different people groups and represent his authority in ways that they would completely understand and feel comfortable with. Hence, legitimizing his rule across the world. This kind of stuff still goes on in some sense. I remember when Google Maps came out, it was very controversial because there are these huge debates in some places in the world about what things should be called. All right, South China Sea, Persian Gulf. Saudi Arabia does not call it the Persian Gulf. Okay, that's Iran. So Google found themselves in this situation. So their fix was this. If you log in from Google and you want to go to some of these hotly contested places in the world, it pings you from your GPS location and gives you the name that your country accepts as the label for that area. So everybody's happy. They see it represented in such a way that pleases them. Kanji is doing the same thing. All right? Imperial portraiture is used in order to assuage the fears of people he ruled. Now, students sometimes ask, well, what did Buddhists think of this? They already knew this piece of work was somebody else. How would they? I really don't know the answer. I mean, what? I don't want to explore this thought, but pictures that you see in churches of Jesus, what if, like, Biden or Trump just put their face on top of Jesus. I don't know that that would go over that well for either side. I don't know. Maybe you'd like that. But I don't know how it went over. But anyway, this is imperial portraiture. And a lot more to talk about the Chinese, which will continue maybe tomorrow, but definitely next week. And then we'll move on to the Russians. The Russians use art, and they also use churches that they build as memorials to military victory. That's very important. The marriage of the state and the church and religion. All right, Andy's done. Thank you, guys.